real. It's okay. It's not real. It's not real. Relax. There's no such thing.
Dad, you have to listen to me.
Okay, I'm listening.
Hey guys, what's happening? Niyat here with Film Comics Explained. As requested, today we'll be exploring The Boogeyman, the 2023 supernatural horror directed by Rob Savage, based on a 1973 short story by Stephen King. While the short story focused on a disturbing conversation between a psychiatrist called Dr. Harper and Lester Billings, a new client claiming that his 3 children were murdered by an entity they called the Boogeyman, the film effectively picks up after those events. Starring Chris Messina, David Dastmalchian, Sophie Thatcher, Vivien Lyra Blair, Marin and LisaGay Hamilton, the movie revolves around the Harpers, who are still grappling with the death of their Matriarch Cara, killed in a recent car accident. The trauma that begins separating them, and Lester's fear and belief in the Boogeyman, begins serving as a gateway for the dark malignant force that begins hounding them. The Harpers must confront the being head-on, or it will feed on their misery and potentially consume them all. In this video, we're going to explore the short story in full, the film which follows directly after, in addition to the entity and the ending of the narrative.
When there are scary things we don't understand, our minds try to fill in the blanks.
It's just like all those spooky monsters you think are hiding under your bed.
Originally published in the March 1973 issue of Cavalier, before being added to Stephen King's 1978 short story collection titled Night Shift, The Boogeyman is a wild descent into the mind of a man on the brink. The entire story takes place in the office of Dr. Harper, a psychiatrist our main character decides to confide in. "I came to you because I want to tell my story," the man on Dr. Harper's couch was saying. The man was Lester Billings from Waterbury, Connecticut. According to the history taken from Nurse Vickers, he was 28, employed by an industrial firm in New York, divorced, and the father of 3 children, all deceased. "I can't go to a priest because I'm not a Catholic. I can't go to a lawyer because I haven't done anything to consult a lawyer about. All I did was kill my kids, one at a time. Killed them all." When asked by Dr. Harper if he truly believed he killed them, Lester tells him, "No. But I was responsible. Denny in 1967, Shirl in 1971, and Andy this year. I want to tell you about it." The short story does not waste time jumping in, giving us an image of Lester as a paranoid individual that might very well be insane. Lester explains that Denny and Shirl died under mysterious circumstances. Denny's death was labelled as crib death, while Shirl's demise was thought to have been due to convulsions. Shockingly, both children yelled out "Boogeyman" a number of times, and after being left alone, despite Lester knowing he'd closed their closet doors, he came back to find them dead, and the closet slightly open. His children were effectively terrified of something, but thinking they needed to overcome their fear by force, he opted to just tell them that there was no monster. Under normal circumstances, encouraging them that they had nothing to be afraid of and telling them that there were no creatures in the closet would be okay, except in this case, he was wrong. Although quite young, both Denny and Shirl were forced to stay in a room they were scared of, and the guilt of his actions has become too much to bear. What makes the short story so interesting is that Lester has many awful character traits. He's an open alcoholic, coward, racist, and angry man with contempt for just about everyone around him. He's even extremely hostile to the mild-mannered Dr. Harper, either insulting him or wresting control over the tempo and rhythm of the session by force. Lester also paints a picture of a hostile relationship with his wife Rita, whom he married when he was 21 and she was 18, after finding out she was pregnant with Denny. He tells us his parents hated Rita and essentially cut him out, effectively disowning him, fueling much of his contempt for both Rita and Denny. He says that he loves them, but when he describes their interactions as a family, it's clear that Lester had a bit of disdain for being tied down. It started when Denny was almost 2 and Shirl was just an infant. He started crying when Rita put him to bed. At first, I thought he was crying because he didn't have a bottle to take to bed anymore. Rita said, "Don't make an issue of it. Let it go. Let him have it and he'll drop it on his own." But that's the way kids start off bad. You get permissive with them, spoil them, then they break your heart. Get some girl knocked up, or start shooting dope. With Denny crying more often and claiming that there was a boogeyman, Lester even hit him, ignoring his pleas for them to leave the light on. The notion of light and dark becomes essential to understanding the entity in both the short story and film, and we'll explore this further later. Regardless, furious that Rita had taught him a word like boogeyman, despite her insistence that he came up with it on his own, Lester becomes even more angry. That was a bad summer for me. The only job I could get was loading Pepsi Cola trucks in a warehouse, and I was tired all the time. Cheryl would wake up and cry every night, and Rita would pick her up and sniffle. I tell you, sometimes I felt like throwing them both out a window. Christ, kids drive you crazy sometimes. You could kill them. Here King begins to allude that the story of the Boogeyman might be a lie, that Lester had indeed killed his children and destroyed his family, but the truth is much stranger. Pointing out his own upbringing, Lester then gives us a window into why he made the decision to ignore the pleas of his children, sealing their fate. It hurt me, of course it did. But you can't get overprotective. You make a kid a cripple that way. When I was a kid, my mum used to take me to the beach and then scream herself hoarse. Don't go out so far, don't go there, it's got an undertow. Even watch out for sharks before God. So what happens? I can't even go near the water now. It's the truth. I get cramps if I go near a beach. You can't overprotect kids, and you can't coddle yourself either. Lester effectively believes that his mother had conditioned him to be afraid. 4 years after Denny passes away due to SIDS, Lester heard and saw something moving in the dark beside Cheryl before discovering she'd passed. An autopsy would reveal that she died of brain convulsions, but once again, he refused to believe the explanations of medical professionals. Thinking the culprit was ultimately supernatural and certain that his kids were telling the truth, Lester was now terrified to have another child. Despite this, a year after Cheryl had passed, they had another boy that Rita named Andrew, whom Billings loved. And much to their surprise, the next year was the best one the family had in a long time. Wanting to leave their old life behind, they moved house, entering a safer community. There, Lester got a new job at a hardware store, and both he and Rita had improved their relationship. They truly began thinking that God had blessed them with a miracle, but it wasn't long until the thought of the Boogeyman crept back into their mind. Billings looked morbidly at the ceiling. Last year wasn't so good. Something about the house changed. I started keeping my boots in the hole because I didn't like to open the closet door anymore. I kept thinking, well, what if it's in there? All crouched down and ready to spring the second I opened the door. And I started thinking I could hear squishy noises, as if something black and green and wet was moving around in there just a little. Rita asked me if I was working too hard, and I started to snap at her, just like the old days. I got sick to my stomach leaving them alone to go to work, but I was glad to get out. I started to think that it lost us for a while when we moved. It had to hunt around, slinking through the streets at night and maybe creeping in the sewers, smelling for us. It took a year, but it found us. Billings was silent for a long time. 2 minutes clicked off the digital clock, then he said abruptly, "Andy died in February." Lester then described seeing oddities around the home, from every door in the house blowing open, a trail of mud leading from the closet to the front door, to records covered in slime, mirrors broken, and even strange whispering sounds. We're led to believe the Boogeyman had returned and was more determined than ever to finish the job, but Lester is also a very unreliable narrator. We're told that while Rita was looking after her mother, Andy called out for him, and upon entering his room, he found the child screaming about the monster, just as his siblings had done. And an hour later, there was a scream, an awful gurgling scream. And I knew how much I loved him because I ran in. I didn't even turn on the light. It had him. It was shaking him just like a terrier shakes a piece of cloth, and I could see something with awful slumped shoulders and a scarecrow head, and I could smell something like a dead mouse in a pop bottle, and I heard. He trailed off, and then his voice clicked back into an adult range. I heard it when Andy's neck broke. Billings' voice was cool and dead. It made a sound like ice cracking when you're skating on a country pond in winter. After admitting he ran to an all-night diner, overwhelmed with fear, and that he was a total failure that let his family down, Lester is interrupted by Dr. Harper, who agrees they had much to discuss. Harper tells him that they can remove the guilt he's been carrying about the deaths and the end of his relationship with Rita, but that Lester needs to want this to happen. Suggesting they schedule a few more appointments to get to the bottom of the issue, Harper reveals he doesn't believe Billings wants absolution, but instead implies that he's looking for punishment for his failings. Then King flips everything on its head with a voice from the closet calling out to Billings. As the Boogeyman shambles out, it's revealed to be holding a mask of Dr. Harper in its rotted spade claw hand, implying it was impersonating Will Harper and that Lester had been telling the truth after all.
Sucked the life right out of them. Even if the first one was an accident, it still made us susceptible. Before they died, my kids, I thought it was just their imaginations getting the better of them, and my oldest tried drawing it for me.
What is this supposed to be?
It's the thing that comes for your kids when you're not paying attention.
Opening prior to Lester's arrival to Dr. Harper's office, the movie showcases the demise of Andy. Making its presence known, a malignant figure opens the closet door and moves across the room, taunting the child by imitating Lester's voice before claiming his life. We're then introduced to the Harpers 1 month after the death of Cara, and on their first day back at school. Still wounded and unable to connect with his daughters Sadie and Sawyer, Will left his clinic and began seeing his clients from home. He both wants to be close to his family, and at the same time directly ignores any of their attempts to discuss Cara, unwilling to give them the support, affection, and closure they desperately needed. Sadie is grieving in her own way, using art as a creative outlet to remember her mother. Sawyer, the youngest in the family, is also upset, with her sadness manifesting in a newfound fear of the dark. In fact, she now has numerous lights in her room to help her sleep at night. While attributed to them being teenagers, with the exception of her friend Bethany, Sadie's group are douchebags and not being very helpful. Instead of offering any real support, Natalie even intentionally humiliates her in front of the group, who let her get away with it. Putting on a brave face for his clients and his kids, Will does his best to hide the fact that he's breaking apart at the seams. But it's very obvious he clearly needs to speak with somebody, especially his own family. Even his clients note that their issues seem insignificant to the trauma his family had been dealing with. Sadie doesn't want to move on, and has some contempt for Will, confusing his refusal to talk about her mother as a sign he didn't care. This trifecta of trauma is just what the Boogeyman needed to nest in their home, and sure enough, when Sawyer wakes up the next morning and turns all the lights off, we get our first clue that danger was on its way. Dropping his kids off at school, Will returns home and is met by Lester Billings. Despite insisting he needed to make an appointment, with Lester begging him and saying that he doesn't know what he's going to do if he doesn't get to talk to someone, Will allows him in. After asking Dr. Harper to close the closet door, just as he did in the short story, Lester recounts the strange deaths of his children and his belief that they were taken by a monster. With the tape recording as every word, Lester recounts a tale we heard in the short story, telling him the entity sucked the life out of them and that he saw it only once. His eldest boy even drew him a sketch before his death of what he saw, one that showcased something waiting in the dark.
My oldest tried drawing it for me.
Quite startled by the turn of events, Will excuses himself, telling the confused Lester he needed to go to the bathroom. Instead, we discover him calling the police, telling them that an unwell man named Lester Billings had just walked into his office. As he makes the call, we spot Sadie returning home after being humiliated by her friend Natalie. Hearing a struggle take place in her room, Sadie enters to find the painting she made of her family ruined, with paint and her things appearing to have been thrown around the place. The girl then hears the voice of Lester pleading with someone in the closet before her father arrives in the room, responding to her scream. It's not until they turn the light on that they find the body of Lester hanging in the closet, suggesting he ended his own life, though the truth, of course, is much spookier. Suspecting that Lester may have killed himself due to guilt, the police brush it off, despite Sawyer insisting that she heard a struggle. Sadie tries to discuss what she heard and saw, and even begins making a connection with her father, but with the discussion on her mother becoming too raw for him, he makes the decision to tell Sadie to bring this up with her therapist instead, something she does in a joint therapy session with her younger sister the following day, where they both air out what's been on their mind. Sadie has become fascinated with whether or not we can effectively communicate with the dead, while Sawyer is becoming more and more afraid of the dark. Their therapist, Dr. Weller, explains that when we're dealing with problems, our minds can create monsters, a focal point to direct our fear and anxiety. But with the young girl seeing the entity appear in the room during some light therapy and freaking out, the session ends horribly. Weller suggests Dr. Harper join them for the next session, advising him not to keep things bottled up, but Will continues to avoid everything. Sawyer is the only one that actually sees the entity at first, noticing weird sounds and shadows in the dark that try to terrify her. However, as Sawyer's fear begins to escalate and Sadie is also haunted by something in the home, the older sister begins to believe her. Noticing the similarity to the entity that Lester had warned them about, Sadie takes the case into her own hands. After listening to the therapy session between Harper and Lester, and seeing the sketch of the Boogeyman, aided by her friend Bethany, she travels to Lester's home. Seemingly abandoned, the place is covered with dark, moldy streaks along the walls and ceilings, and the bizarre sights of hundreds of candles on the ground. It's here she stumbles into Rita, Lester's shotgun-wielding ex-wife, who's now just as unstable as Lester had become.
Fire was the first thing man used to see at night.
It's really been around that long. I think it's been around forever.
Far from the fragile woman she'd once been, the death of her entire family has turned Rita into a vengeful, uncompromising individual that was willing to do anything to capture the entity. Assuming the girl was there to laugh at her family like everyone else, the woman is confrontational at first, but turns sympathetic after hearing about what was happening to the Harpers. Rita explains the boogeyman had stalked her family and was attracted to trauma. With each child it took from the Billings, their pain grew, in turn creating more fuel for the entity. Hearing about how the Harpers had recently lost their matriarch, an event that had destabilized the once happy home, Rita continues by saying their pain and fear was like nectar to the entity. Based on what we see in both the short story and film so far, the boogeyman is essentially a powerful tulpa, a supernatural being made by people's nature to fear the unknown. In folklore, the entity was used by adults to scare children into behaving, and is hinted by Rita as having been around forever, or at least since the dawn of humanity. The boogeyman can now take any shape it wishes, mimic any voice it desires, though it loves to appear as a grotesque humanoid with a tendency to hide under beds, in closets, and other dark places. It cannot stand the light, which is why it waits for them to go out before it began spreading its malevolence. It particularly hates fire, light in its purest form, and the first weapon mankind had used to defeat it throughout history. The dark streaks on the walls, which are a visualization of the corruption, also turn into portals, enabling the boogeyman to instantly travel between locations it is tainted. Terrifying the girl by telling her to stay still as the entity was right behind her, Rita fires a number of shots over the girl's shoulder, causing Sadie to run out in panic. Although traumatized by the event, Sadie musters up her courage and tries to demonstrate to her father that what Lester had told them is true, but Will continues to ignore her plea. He's more concerned about getting rid of all of Cara's things by hiding them in the basement, instead of confronting his trauma, creating more of a rift between the family. While going through her mother's things, Sadie finds a lighter that belonged to her and asks her spirit to move the flame, but nothing happens. Still, old footage of Cara singing to them inspires the girl to have more courage. In fact, whenever Sadie begins to feel terrified in the dark, we see flashes of her mother guiding her towards the light. The boogeyman is essentially indirectly turning the family against each other, aiding in its ability to weaken and eventually consume their fear individually. Just as it did with the Billings children and eventually their father, it wants to break each of the Harpers down before consuming their life essence at their most vulnerable. Unfortunately, the supernatural monster has become bolder, locking Sadie inside a room while she's hanging out with her friends before literally hurling Sawyer's body into a television. Just like Lester, Harper's inability to act and connect with his kids is now becoming just as much of a problem as the boogeyman. And so, with her younger sister hospitalized and Will refusing to believe the truth of what was destroying his family, Sadie returns to Rita's home after being told that she had a plan. The only problem is that the reception is extremely frosty. Believing there was no other way, Rita ties Sadie up, hoping to lure the shadow into an explosive trap, and while she manages to injure it, the entity gets back up and starts tearing the widow to shreds, giving Sadie enough time to run out of the house. The intensity reaches critical point when Will and Sawyer return from the hospital. Calling her father and begging him to listen to her for the first time, Sadie adamantly urges Will not to enter the home as the injured and furious entity was waiting for them. While he agrees to take her seriously, just as he and Sawyer reach the front door, they're physically attacked by the boogeyman, which pulls them into the dark. Frantically returning home, she finds Sawyer hiding with lights cleverly wrapped around her, keeping the entity at bay. Together, the girls bravely descend into the dark basement and battle the entity with light and fire to rescue their injured father. Although the entity manages to temporarily incapacitate Sadie and begins consuming her life force, together they set the entity alight, causing it to burn down along with their home. Showing how far they'd now progressed, we pick up a few days later, with Will, Sawyer, and Sadie finishing a therapy session with Dr. Weller. Finally able to discuss Cara openly, though seeming to keep the story about the literal boogeyman a secret, the Harpers appear to have conquered their fears and hang-ups as a family. As they leave, Sadie hears something coming from Dr. Weller's office, but ultimately deciding that she'd moved on, she closes the literal and symbolic door to the entity, stopping him from resurfacing. However, it should be noted that with so many people in the world for it to feed on, the boogeyman is still around. The movie is a decent attempt at psychological horror, but it chooses to make some weird decisions considering the layup the short story had provided. The most interesting part of King's story is the unraveling of Lester Billings. The more he speaks, the more we realize how broken he was on a fundamental level. Not only a flawed human being that made mistakes, but one that was actively choosing to allow the guilt to take him over and consume him. The skill in King's writing is in its ability to tie parental neglect with the inherent fear children have of the dark. By the end, we're convinced that Lester is so volatile and hateful that he'd in fact directly killed his children out of frustration. Then King pulling the rug, revealing that he wasn't speaking to Harper, but was in fact venting to the entity itself, is what makes us question this entire assessment. But instead of focusing on the most interesting character, brought to life masterfully by David Dastmalchian, the film is about characters not in King's novel.
The fact that it was a Stephen King adaptation and he's, one of my favorite creators wasn't exciting at first. It was actually intimidating to me. And then Dan Cohen, one of the producers of the film, asked me to meet with Rob, and I did, and I really fell for the guy. I think he's pretty special. Horror movies have the opportunity and potential to imbue us with ideas and concepts about things that really matter.
We could have spent at least half of the film split between the therapy session with Dr. Harper and Lester, and the man's account of how each of his 3 children died. This could also be interspliced with Harper remembering the death of Cara. At the halfway point, the film could have organically shown his demise by the Boogeyman as Harper was calling the police. But the entire short story is expended in the first 10 minutes, and the death of Lester becomes a catalyst for the film and the dark events plaguing the family, where really, thematically, it should have been the death of Cara. Dr. Harper, who's the only other character physically present in the short story, appears professional, stern, and courteous throughout, responding to Lester's version of events with comments and questions designed to keep him talking. He is the least interesting part of the story, and they knew this, which is why the film ended up revolving around his daughters. I understand that his detachment from his kids is what makes them the perfect target for the Boogeyman, but where the short story demonstrated how unprepared Lester was for not only marriage, children, but also life in general, the more than capable Dr. Harper simply stops wanting to help his children. Lester even gives us his rationale for the tough love he gave his kids. I understood why Lester made the decisions he did, and I get the setup for Will's apathy as Cara's death, but Chris Messina has nothing to do throughout the film beyond that.
And then talking to the director, Rob Savage, and getting an understanding of what he wanted to do with it, which was a more human story. The Boogeyman, which is a really scary monster in this movie, is also all the stuff that's lurking inside of these people.
His character is just distant father that refuses to connect with his children, despite the many opportunities Sadie set up for him. There's a great motif about how light can defeat the dark, and fragments of great imagery and creative cinematography. As I said, David Dastmalchian is a terrific character actor that is underutilized. Marin, who plays his wife Rita, is just as electric in the brief scenes we get. Considering the short story captured such a turbulent relationship, the film should have been about the Billings. With that said, Sophie Thatcher brings a gentle strength to her character. She's just as traumatized and scared as everyone else, but with her sister's life at stake, Sadie is forced to transform into a mother well before her years. Little Vivien Blair's Sawyer is afforded some courage, seen confronting the entity a number of times by using light to help stop the darkness from spreading, but she's ultimately too small to defeat the Boogeyman by herself. Both Thatcher and Blair carry the film on their shoulders, propelled by the appearances of Dastmalchian and Ireland that help establish the world building. The horror scenes are great. I just wish they could have put more effort into the thematic and narrative threads that are supposed to ground the terror. This was written by the same guys that penned A Quiet Place, but it feels like the antithesis of that story. Rather than a timeless tale of parents willing to die for their children, making smart decisions to preserve their progeny, we're given a grim visage of detached parenthood at its very worst. The first half is no doubt engaging, as the premise and inciting incidents are laid bare, but the film is so eager to get to the end that it stumbles with a rushed second half, limited character development, predictable jump scares, and a very sorely lacking emotional payoff.
They called it the Boogeyman. Yeah, that's the way I used to look at them. Like they were crazy. Found out the hard way I was wrong.
With that said, that's all for today, folks. A huge thanks to everyone that voted we cover the Boogeyman. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to stay up to date on all my content, and if there's anything else you'd like to request, please don't hesitate to ask. As always, it's been a pleasure. Niyat here with Film Comics Explained. Thanks for stopping by.
When there are scary things we don't understand, sometimes the best thing to do is to face it.